I wanted, before we get started, this is where we left off last time, but I do want to address something that, both Denny and Mac have brought up in that Walter Brueggemann is not going to draw on some of the research that has been common to our discussions for the last several years, and that is, the historical Jesus, what we know about the Gospels and when they were written, why they were written, to whom they were written. This is one of the disadvantages of reading a book that's now 50 years old. And Brueggemann's approach is going to be informed more by where he was at the time when he was writing this book. This book came out in 1978, and I'm going to guess, I don't know this for sure, but I'm going to guess that this was probably part of his dissertation that he wrote. So, in the 70s, he had an orientation, a context that was quite different than our own. And the information that he had available to him is quite different than our own. Uh, he is a UCC pastor. He, at the time when this book was written, was teaching at Eden Theological Seminary. And Eden is in St. Louis. And at the time, in the 1960s and the 1970s, there were two things that were very important that were happening at Eden. One of those is, you could probably guess, the whole civil rights movement. But the other aspect of that, the theological curriculum there involved something known as ecumenism, ecumenical. How is it? We don't even hear about ecumenism anymore, which is an interesting question in and of itself. But basically, by the 1950s, late 1950s, Christian churches, and this included the Catholic Church as well, were coming to realize that their differences were becoming so great that they were finding it very difficult to communicate with each other and almost being at odds with each other, right? This was represented, well, first of all, Vatican II in 1967 was an attempt to try to, bring the Roman Catholic Church into conversation with what was happening in contemporary culture. And then the ecumenical movement was also trying to do that as well. They were becoming so distinct in terms of their theological understanding of, let's say, baptism or what happens in the Eucharist and what ministry is all about, that the movement of ecumenism came to be, okay, let's all decide what we can agree on. And so at the time, there was a organization, and I think it's still around. I just don't ever hear about it anymore. Something called the World Council of Churches. And so in the United States and across the world, the question was, how can we begin to, start working towards a common cause? And they created a document called what was referred to when I was in seminary. And this would have been about the time that Brueggemann was writing, or a little bit before. Um, but it was called BEM, Baptism, Eucharist, and Ministry, the place where people could commonly come in and discuss with each other was on the two sacraments and the intent, the objective of what we're doing as a church in ministry. It wasn't about child baptism versus a believer baptism, but the fact that baptism was at the center of the church's understanding of itself. The Eucharist, that the breaking of the bread and the sharing of the wine was symbolic of what the body of Christ does to either commemorate or to observe uh, being in being a member of the body of Christ. And so at Eden Theological Seminary, where Brueggemann was teaching, those questions were being addressed. And so when I read his book and I think about some of the objections that we have. Well, wait a minute now. I mean, he should at least know that Luke was writing to a particular audience versus, somebody else. Uh, at the time of his writing, that the Jesus seminar was just coming into existence, really. Now, people had discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the whole question of historicism was being addressed at the time. But we have the advantage of 50 years of people like John Dominic Crossan, Marcus Borg, and others of really delving into these New Testament texts. What Brugge and this is basically what I want to say here. What Brueggemann is interested in is ministry, and ministry as a common um, a common concern for all churches. And how is it that Jesus ministry can address some of the problems of the 1960s, 1970s, and of course, when we think about that, we think about civil rights, and we think about emerging liberation theology, which was also happening at this time. So that's the context out of which he's writing. And I'm very proud of all of us because we've kind of taken on this this paradigm where we naturally think uh, like people in the historical Jesus movement think, using the historical critical method and knowing, pretty much what flies and what doesn't when making comments about what Jesus meant and what was written when and things like that. So I say that because I keep coming across these places where in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, oh, they're now Mac Martin and Mac would have something to say about this. Uh, and so I just wanted to make that little comment before we started, because if when we get to the last chapter, you will see very clearly that Brueggemann has the ministry of the church in mind. He has establishing some groundwork for people to become involved with the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, but also to have a theological and biblical background behind that. And to that end, I think he does a very good job, um, and an inspiring job for folks. So, any thoughts about ecumenism? Um,
Dan,
yeah, Danny.
I'm thinking too that a big impact on Walter Brueggemann, he was probably finishing his bachelor's degree and maybe in grad school, right at the apex of the Vietnam War.
Right. Oh, yeah.
And, that must have been a very painful experience for many, many theologians.
Right. Yeah. I should. Yeah. That. Yeah. I remember that. In fact, I wasn't even aware of it, but I can't help but think of what my parents were thinking. Here I was, a young kid in 1972, and the war was still going on then, and uh, just the anxiety that my parents must have had, like, gosh, is Dan going to be drafted? And luckily in 19 was it 1973 or 74? I can't remember what that was. I remember I was in high school when the war ended, and the draft was called off and everything.
74, I think.
Yeah. But yeah, that consumed my childhood. I remember, I think I've said this to you before, but I remember at a very young age listening to Walter Cronkite talking about American troops fighting guerrillas uh, in Vietnam, and I was like, why, what they got against guerrillas? What what have gorillas ever done to them? Not Guerilla, but Gori. Uh, but that was just part of my consciousness growing up. So trying to address some of that discontent that was happening. I think the prophetic imagination did a very good job of that at the time. So, any other comments about this?
Dan, I was looking back over what we talked about last time, and I think one of the ideas that we were talking about was the forgiveness. And I know
Yeah,
you're going into the rest of the items today, but part of what he had written there was talking about our society not having an apparatus for forgiveness. And I wondered if restorative justice was at all rising as an idea when he was writing this, and what we might see as an alternative today is that apparatus?
Yeah, certainly, restorative justice was on people's minds at that time. There was so much happening at this time. We think about the African American rights movement, not just the civil rights movement, but also Black identity and women's identity, and that the whole idea of restoration. But who's the one who needs to be forgiving in that? It's not the blacks, it's not women, it's people like me, the white American males in that. But just trying to come back to an established understanding of what it means to live in a Christian as opposed to an American culture. Because there was so much about American culture that was seeping into the church at that time as well. I mean, we have our Christian nationalism now, but it was apparent back then as well. You probably remember situations in where churches were in an upheaval about taking the American flag out of the sanctuary. Do you remember any of those conflicts? Just the pastors would have strategies of moving the American flag just 1 foot to the right every month or so, until eventually the flag was completely removed from the sanctuary. But so there's so much here that requires us to really reflect on what our standard, what is our moral standard, and where do we establish our foundation. And there's so much about capitalism, there's so much about nationalism that so easily seeps into who we are. And this is precisely what Brueggemann is trying to say. This is who Jesus was. And he was a person who, Brueggemann uses the prophets, specifically two prophets, Jeremiah and second Isaiah, and specifically two aspects of the prophet's life. And that was criticizing, then energizing. In chapter 5, we're looking at the way that Jesus stood up and not just verbally criticized, but embodied criticism against the dominant culture of his time, what Brueggemann's calling the imperial imagination or the royal consciousness. And we talked about those several ways last time. Jesus had table fellowship with sinners and outcasts. He healed people that, everyone was very, very pleased to have them on the margins of society as well. Women were part of his entourage. All of this is an affront to the powers that be. And then we left off last time with Jesus challenging the whole idea of taxation in his very sly way at being asked by the scribes and the Pharisees at the temple, is it right to pay taxes to Caesar? And Jesus, and this is in all three of the Gospels, the Synoptic Gospels: render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's. And I think that encapsulates what we're trying to talk about here. How much Caesar's the royal consciousness, God is the alternative consciousness. And a lot of this gets caught up in his criticism of the temple. And this pick up where we left off last time. Disciples are talking to him about how wonderful the temple is, and Jesus says, "Well, I'll tell you, you tear it down, and in 3 days I will rebuild it." Jesus understands that the temple represents so much of the royal consciousness and of a capitulation to the royal consciousness. The temple, priesthood was a priesthood that ostensibly was following the law, but in so doing was creating a dissension, was creating a chasm between themselves and the people of God, right? And Jesus, following the prophetic tradition, the prophets I think of Amos and I think of Hosea. The prophets didn't have any love for the temple. They saw it as a major distraction, right? They saw it as a bauble that kept people from understanding what God's true call for them was. I despise your solemn festivals. So this is what eventually gets Jesus killed. Um, and this idea, this is a more abstract to understanding, but this idea of righteousness, right? That, following the law is something that all people are expected to do. Well, that just works into the hands of the people in power. And I call this a kind of proto-Marxist critique on page 87, pretty much what Brueggemann is saying about Jesus, um, that the law had become a means of control. Um, the law had become, in his day, I'm on the bottom of page 87. The law had become, in his day, a way for the managers of society, religious even more than civil, to effectively control not only morality, but the political economic valuing that lay behind that morality. Thus, his criticism of the law, Jesus' criticism, is not to be dismissed as an attack on legalism in any moralistic sense. And I think this is an important, because I tend to think, well, Jesus didn't like the legalists, but it goes deeper than that. There's another dimension to it. Not an attack on legalism in any moralistic sense, as is sometimes done in reductionistic Pauline interpretation. Rather, his critique concerns the fundamental social valuing of his society. In practice, Jesus has seen, as Marx later made clear, that the law can be a social convention to protect the current distribution of economic and political power. Uh, that's uh, that's a nice reminder, right? That's his Brueggemann's kind of under Marxist understanding of Jesus. Now, that's the kind of thing in the 1970s that would have gotten, Brueggemann through, because we're still dealing in, kind of the holdover of the Red Scare at that time. Uh, but Brueggemann very bravely just puts it right out there. Hey, Marx pointed this out the same way Jesus. Religion is an opiate of the people, and it is devised by those in power to keep those who are not in power under their control. So, um, so all of this righteousness of the law is just a smokescreen. Over against that, you have the notion of what lay at the heart of Jesus' whole ministry, and that is compassion. Um, you know, we saw this in the sermon this Sunday. We were following the narrative lectionary at First Presbyterian Church, so I don't know, Alan Mack, what your sermon was on Sunday, but it was on John, where Jesus heals the son of a magistrate. We don't even know if he was a Jewish person, but he was a civil authority, and Jesus kind of heals him from afar. Go home, your son is fine. And then directly after that, there's a man lying at the pool of Bethzatha, which is where the spirit would come and stir up the pool, and people who had various illnesses would try to get themselves into the pool to be healed, right? There was a man there, 38 years, had not had any uh, help at all to get to the pool, and he was in a completely debilitated state. And Jesus says, "Do you want to be healed?" And the man says, "Sure, I do." And he says, "Get up and walk." And he gets up and walk. Well, lo and behold, after that, this happened to be the Sabbath, right? Uh, the Sabbath is a time, the Pharisees saw this man walking along carrying his mat, and they said, "Hey, you're not supposed to be carrying your mat. That's work, and that's a violation of the law." And the man did what most people did. Well, this guy told me I could, right? And they eventually find Jesus, and the question becomes, what is required of us, to follow the law or to, have compassion. And compassion will always, if you pardon the term, trump the law, right? But the Pharisees were unable to imagine something like that. They had been so caught up in their very legalistic way of looking at things, and also may have had a fear of loss of power. Um, Now, Steve in his class, Steve Thomason in his class did point out something very that I think we should always keep in mind is that when it comes to the authorities, the religious authorities that were in Jesus' time, you had the Sadducees, you had the Pharisees, the Zealots, the Essenes, the Herodians. The group of people that Jesus was closest to, it was the Pharisees. Jesus and the Pharisees were at least on the same page in terms of what they understood and how they saw the world. So we don't always want to, have the Pharisees pointed out as the bad guys. They were just the ones that Jesus could have a conversation with, assuming, equal starting points, right? Equal assumptions. Um, but this compassion that Jesus has, this is the means of his radical public criticism, and of course, it gets him in trouble. Um, Brueggemann does a little word study on uh, this Greek word, which it's really important to point out. I think splagchnizomai. Uh, Compassion means being able. The word in its original form in the Greek kind of suggests, of having a common pathos with somebody, common passion. But its original intent is being moved to such an extent that it gives you a stomach ache, basically. You feel you feel it within your body. It's a very visceral response. And come to think, I hadn't thought about this before, and I'm going to tell you something a little bit personal here, but there are times, and maybe some of you have had this as well, but when you see somebody who is going through so much pain, uh, sometimes I'll be gripped by this sense of I feel it in the bottom of my spine. Just a very brief experience, like I can't imagine what that feels like. Watching somebody uh, you know, being shot or, well, for example, like in Minneapolis. Have any of you had that experience or is it just me? But I think that's exactly what we're talking about here. This compassion where you literally feel someone's pain in a very, uh, very concrete way. So Jesus demonstrates this when, probably in the very first way that we know of in the feeding of the 5,000, when he's off in the desert and, the people have followed him out there and he recognized these people have no food. And the Matthean account of this offers two words that are very, very important. Jesus has compassion, but he also understands what the source of that compassion is. These people are harassed and helpless. These are words that are added to the Markan account, right? In other words, adding a political dimension. When someone's harassed and helpless, there is someone else who has been harassing them and making them feel that way. And so uh, Jesus feeds these people not out of a sense of, obligation, but out of a sense of compassion, out of a sense of feeling their pain. So let me stop and see if there are any questions about that. this becomes clear, of course, in the two parables that are probably both most associated with Jesus, and that is the parable of the Good Samaritan and the parable of the prodigal son. Um, there is this fellow feeling, you might say, that becomes so internalized that it evokes an external transformation, right? It's not that you feel the pain, but the pain is such, or the experience is such, is that it creates in you an external transformation. Think of the Samaritan seeing the man by the side of the road, and he is consumed with compassion for him. So much so that he goes to great lengths. He places him on his donkey, takes him to an inn, and pays for his upkeep. Says, "I'll be back tomorrow if he needs anything." I mean, what an example of that. I mean, the internalized pain boiled over, you might say, into an external kind of transformation. Same with the father in the prodigal son. Uh, it's kind of ironic. We all know, or I think we all know, that the real prodigal son here is not the one who runs off and ends up living with the pigs, but the one who stays home and feels, you know, self-righteous about how he deserves more than his younger brother, right? That's the prodigal, the guy in the Rembrandt painting off here on the right, standing and kind of looking down his nose at his brother. But the son who runs away um, comes back, and he's just been through the ringer, right? You can see Rembrandt demonstrates just how forlorn he is. His hair is completely shorn, which is a symbol. It has always been a symbol of, you cut your hair in a time of mourning, in a time of grief. He's dressed in rags, completely colorless, whereas his father and brother are wearing these these colorful red ruby robes. And then the real clincher here is that he's got one shoe and another, he doesn't even have another shoe, inability to take care of himself right down to his very shoes. And his father has compassion, so much so. I mean, even as the son is on his return, off in the distance, the father runs out to meet him. The internalization of the pain that he sees with his son on his way becomes an external transformation. He responds in compassion. Compassion becomes, if you will, incarnate. So, Brueggemann, I like this quote: "The one thing the dominant culture cannot tolerate or co opt is compassion, the ability to stand in solidarity with the victims of the present order. It can, and I like this, it can manage charity and good intentions, right? But has no way to resist solidarity with pain or grief. The imperial consciousness lives by its capacity to still the groans and to go on with business as usual, as though none were hurting and there were no groans." You know, and I can think of example after example of that. Whereas, where caring for the poor becomes a matter of efficiency, right? It becomes a matter of proper administration, the welfare system, uh, but does not have as its core this idea of compassion. And this is the criticism that Jesus brings to the royal consciousness. It's not about administering, goods. It's about embodying, the love for the other and the fellow feeling for another. So tell me your thoughts, if you have any. Well, Brueggemann then goes on to say that this articulated grief, like this, becomes the gate of newness, becomes the thing that is going to take the numbness and turn it into a newness. And he doesn't spend much time on this, but the idea of the rich man of Lazarus is a nice, what's the right word for it? It's a nice object lesson in this. The rich man who, uh, when I hear the story, I can't help but think of the times that I I saw this again and again living in New York City, and it to such an extent that you just get convicted in your feelings. But along let's say Broadway up in the Upper West Side, you would have these restaurants, right, that had these outdoor cafes, and there would be people eating at these restaurants, eating these incredibly wonderful meals, shrimp and crab, things like that. But there would be people on the sidewalk, homeless people, kind of looking over the gate saying, "Hey, can you give me, a little something?" It became a real problem because they were begging, with nothing but just like this iron fence between them, right? And not a very high fence. It's very similar to what we're talking about with the rich man and Lazarus. You've got this rich man who walks out his gate every day, and he kind of almost stumbles over the poor man, Lazarus. Uh, but then the story is inverted. There's an inversion that takes place that upon the death, the rich man is in anguish, whereas Lazarus is in the bosom of Abraham. And this idea of the complete transformation is the result of or is the outcome of this story. And this is the kind of transformation, this living in a different kingdom that Brueggemann wants to try to emphasize, is that through compassion, the numbness that's required of the royal consciousness is is can be opened, and the seed of newness can be planted. You might say, and this compassion we see in Jesus, in his ministry, and he embodies this idea of incarnation, that Jesus is the Word incarnate, but Jesus is also compassion incarnate as well. He's embodied anguish. And we see this when he weeps over the death of his friend Lazarus, and also weeps over Jerusalem itself in Luke chapter 19, very much like Jeremiah did. Both of these are a weeping over death, the death of a man, but the death of a city that has reached its end, and nobody recognizes the end. This is Jeremiah all over again. This isn't Luke, but I think this is Matthew. How often I would have gathered you to my side like a mother gathers her chicks. Um, in Luke 19, Jesus is crying over the city that has turned away the prophets. He knows that the city is at its end. The city does not know. Um, but I want to move on here. This idea of compassion, I wanted to read this. There's so many quotes at the end of this chapter. You're going to have to forgive me because I'm going to be reading a lot of them. But the compassion of Jesus has two sides, says Brueggemann. On the one hand, and this is the criticism. We're still in the critique that Jesus is offering here. The compassion of Jesus has two sides. On the one hand, it is a frontal attack upon the dominant culture. Jesus grieves over the death of the old world and the old city, even when most did not know that it was dead or on its way to death. It's very much like Jeremiah weeping over Jerusalem. His criticism is not in anger, but in pathos. Jesus' compassion is not only criticism of what is deadly, for in his criticism, criticism and solidarity, he evidences power to transform. So his embrace of death uh, embrace of the death. Oh, I didn't write. His people are dying. So his embrace of the death his people are dying leads to restored Lazarus, to healed people, to fed crowds, to a cared for man, to an accepted son, and to good news for the harassed and the helpless. The heavy criticism of Jesus holds the offer and possibility of an alternative beginning. So this is where the transformation can take place, and it as demonstrated in these stories, the man cared for in Lazarus, the crowds being fed, the people that are being healed, the harassed and helpless being taken care of. It appears to me that I really don't need to rely on my spell checker. I've got a couple misspelled words in this, so um, any thoughts? I don't want to be the only one talking here. So
Dan, could you flip back to that previous slide?
this one here, is that Denny? You're not. You're still muted.
Yeah. The next one up, forward.
Okay, Brueggemann. Okay.
I think one of the key words for me is in the last sentence is the possibility. Possibility, sometimes Walter Brueggemann has a hard time really articulating that word possibility. It's always absolute.
Ah,
The end, the death, and of the royal consciousness. And I think historically, a lot of people would raise the question, has the royal consciousness, in one guise or another, ever ceased to exist?
yeah, yeah.
And
I would say, go ahead.
part of that emanates, what I'm thinking is, um, out of the culture of scarcity and the culture of survival, and survival in the largest positive context of providing for one's family and doing what needs to be done in a positive way, not just rapaciousness, um, that sometimes compels people to make some very difficult choices, and ones which are not necessarily supportive of what Walter Brueggemann's talking about, or what society ideally
Right.
needs to remain an integrated whole.
Yeah. Can you give me an example of what you're talking about? I know what you're saying. I think your ultimate critique here is this is very idealistic.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
And again, the word possibility, I don't get that impression that Walter really believes that, um, it is a possibility around the margins, and it always is chewing at the edge of you know, in the Lord's Prayer. I never knew as a kid about, um, avoiding temptation. They talking about, love for ice cream at breakfast, or 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 avoiding being swallowed up by consumerism. And I
Yeah.
think it's the latter.
Right. Right. Yeah. And again, I think this is why I gave you my little introduction, because he's speaking as a minister and not as a historian. Um, and the next section of this chapter makes it all the more difficult, because now we're talking about the crucifixion. This compassion is such that the embodied anguish goes so far to embody the death of the royal consciousness. Jesus, and this is something that doesn't have its corollary in Moses, right? But the thing that makes Jesus the great prophet is that not only does, like Jeremiah, not only does he see that Jerusalem is dying and the old way is passing away and a new way is on a new covenant is on its way, but he embodies that. He embodies the anguish. Jesus embodies it. He embodies the anguish. He embodies the anguish of those who are on the margins of society, but he also embodies the death that is the absolute result of that. And I find myself, okay, I find myself falling back into what Brueggemann calls the royal consciousness. Like, how does that demonstrate anything? How does that, you have to have the resurrection on the other end to keep this in mind. Um, but Jesus doesn't just announce the death of, of the city, the death of the royal consciousness. He doesn't just announce the end itself. He embraces it, and not only embraces it, but in the most heinous of ways. You know, his his approach to Jerusalem, as we see in Mark, where he makes his announcements in Mark's in three different chapters, 8, 9, and 10, that the Son of Man must suffer many things. It's a dismissal of this self-serving power. He's going to demonstrate in no uncertain terms what the results of this royal consciousness power is. And the reaction of the disciples is just like my reaction, either disbelief or incomprehension. Or the other thing that they do in one of these announcements is they all talk about who's going to be the greatest in the kingdom. It's just like completely they're doing their own self-serving thing, right? But it's incomprehension that I feel like I struggled with this when I'm reading it, because it really takes an act of faith to say that this death is going to usher in something new, that this death is going to cause a kind of a global transformation that we're talking about here. Uh, but there is, if I'm reading it as not as a historical event, but as a symbolic story, uh, I can appreciate a little bit more of what Brueggemann is talking about. He makes this argument that Jesus' sayings on the cross really embody and really reflect uh, Jesus' attitude, Jesus' position vis-a-vis the royal consciousness. First of all, he comes back to forgiveness, and Brugge makes this really interesting point that Jesus, as the judge, right, is arguing that those who are crucifying him be forgiven because they are the victims of what we might call a temporary insanity. Uh, so he even has compassion on those who are doing what they're, doing to him, right? Forgive them for they know not what they do. They're crazy. They're caught up in this royal consciousness so much that they don't see the possibility, that lies on the other side here. Um, and into thy hands I offer my spirit. This is a reference to abandonment, says Brueggemann, that the old is gone. Jesus is offering up symbolically the death of the old way of being, the royal consciousness. And along with that, Brueggemann is talking about the so-called seven last words from the cross. We know that Jesus says different things in the different gospels, and they've come to be known traditionally as the seven last words for the cross. The other is, into thy hands I uh, commit my spirit. I commit my spirit. Jesus giving complete submission to the powers that be, right? But here's the one that I think is so important. Um, and it's why I put this image of the crucifixion with two thieves on either side. Uh, in the Gospel of John, the two thieves represent the old and the new. There's one, the one who represents the new his name is Dismas, and he is the traditionally, I don't think his name is in the Bible. I'm pretty sure it's not, but he's traditionally come to be known as Dismas and as the patron saints of all ne'er-do-wells. Um, and he, Jesus is on the cross, and one of the men says, "Hey, if you're so great, why don't you get us all out of here? You're nothing." He's mocking Jesus. That is the royal consciousness, right? That is the old that's passing away. But then Dismas, on the other hand, says, you know, remember me when you come into your kingdom. Uh, and that is the new possibility. And so the image here is one of the passing. You have the one man on the left who is the old way, and then you have the one man on the left who's the royal consciousness, the dominant society. And then you have the man on the right who is uh, you know, the one to enter the kingdom, the one who is going to undergo the transformation in the same way that Jesus did through the suffering, right? And having compassion really on Jesus, understanding Jesus' compassion along with his own, or understanding Jesus' suffering, excuse me, along with his own. So this, according to Brueggemann, this lies at the heart of uh, one of the most beautiful hymns in the entire New Testament. And, and it's understood to be probably the oldest uh, hymn that we know of that predates Paul, right? It was an affirmation of faith. Remember, Paul was writing somewhere between 50 and 60, most of his letters. And he, in one of his earliest letters, a letter to the Philippians, he quotes a hymn that this church in Philippi seems already to know. He goes, it's like me saying, yeah, it's like the words of that famous Beatles song, and in the end, or something like that. And Paul's doing this. He's saying, I'm going to quote that hymn that we all know so well. And it goes like this. Uh, I want you to have the same attitude as Jesus, Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God as a thing to be grasped, but he emptied himself, taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men. And being found in human form, he humbled himself and became obedient unto death, even death on a cross. Therefore, God has highly exalted him and bestowed on him the name which is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee shall bow, in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. The way this hymn is set up, if you read it on page 98, there are three stanzas that talk about Jesus emptying himself, talking about his suffering. Then there's this transformation. Therefore, this might be the resurrection part of the hymn. Therefore, God highly exalted him, um, and so on. And so, this is what Brueggemann has in mind, that unlike Jeremiah, unlike Moses before him, Jesus is able to embody this anguish and make the grief of the marginalized incarnate, but at the same time, also to make incarnate the resurrection or the transformation that happens as a result of this. And so, yeah, I'll conclude with this uh, comment from Brueggemann, and then I'll hear if you have anything to say. But I really liked his concluding section, the words in this concluding section. The tradition of radical criticism is about the self-emptying of Jesus, about dominion through the loss of dominion, and about fullness coming only from self-emptying. This is a thoroughly political image concerned with the willing surrender of power. It is the very thing kings cannot do and yet remain kings. Thus, the entire royal self-understanding is refuted. The empty one who willingly surrendered power for obedience is the ultimately powerful one who can permit humanness where no other has authority to do so. And I think the emphasis on humanness here is important, almost as if to say that everything about the royal consciousness mitigates against our true humanness. Our true humanness is that ability to have compassion and to suffer with others and to create a new reality out of that suffering. Um, so any thoughts, any questions as this is not the conclusion of that chapter. I still have one little section to go, but that's where we'll begin next time. Um,
Dan, I just like to make the comment. I think what you just read to me is really one of the key parts of this uh, effort on Brueggemann's part. And I also think it's important to emphasize what we talked about a little bit earlier, you did, to understand the rejection of the royal consciousness. We don't do it out of a sense of anger. We do it out of pathos. Now that is kind of consistent with the Mosaic,
yeah,
but to me that's the insight that I've really received the most from this study.
right. And doing it out of anger is simply uh, responding like with like, isn't it? It's like like when you're a kid and your dad used to spank you because you hit your sister, right? It's like
No, it's the Mel Gibson view of Jesus.
exactly. Oh, please say more about that, Mac.
Well, his movie where it's all blood and guts and gore and where it's revenge and persecution. No, it's not
Right.
that.
Yeah. Which goes to our theory of atonement, right? It's Jesus on the cross as God punishing Jesus in place of all human beings. No, it's Jesus on the cross in solidarity with the suffering of human beings. And and that's important for us to keep in mind still. I've got a friend who's, wants to talk to me about she's got a niece who's going through cancer treatment and is just suffering and suffering and suffering. And she wants to know, well, she said, I mean, I'm losing my faith in all of this. And the response I want to give to her is, I like what you're saying. Don't have the Mel Gibson view of God, right? Somehow that this person is being punished by God for some reason. No, God is suffering through that person's suffering, as evidenced by what Jesus did, right? Um, even to death on the cross, as Paul writes in Philippians. And I think that's really important to keep in mind. So I appreciate your comment on that. Any other thoughts that you all have?
Yeah, Dan,
Yeah.
it seems to me that too often compassion slides to the dark side in the sense that um, compassion becomes transactional. You know, you take care of me, and I'll give you a pardon. Oh, did I say pardon? Oh, ah, uh,
Yeah, if well, it's almost I don't even like to hear you refer to that as compassion. It's simply a transaction,
I agree, but I'm just saying those folks look upon it as, oh, aren't we being compassionate when you and I
Right,
wouldn't, yeah, I mean, that just kind of curls in the throat.
right, right, exactly. Yeah, and that's the kind of we were talking about it earlier about uh, compassion is not something that can be managed efficiently by our government programs or anything like that. There's no grabbing of the gut that happens in that, we hand out welfare checks and that's transactional just as well as pardons, right? But the compassion that comes from you know, the pain that sinks deeply into the bowels, the fellow feeling that sinks deeply into the bowels, um, that's what Jesus felt and embodied. Um, well,
Uh,
thank you. Go ahead, Denny.
Dan, I have a hard time, equating, you know, Trump's notion of pardons, justification, with government programs that are trying their best, to alleviate suffering, whether it's through food programs or health subsidies or whatever.
Yeah,
Uh, I
I
mean,
understand what you're saying, and I probably shouldn't use that example, but they can become very rote. People will lose. Yeah, yeah. Forget I said that. I understand what you're saying because most people who are in those programs do have this sense of compassion. Um,
and I'm thinking, Dan, that a lot of evangelicals, from what I read, have, a very different notion of, um, suffering. And suffering is really good for you, like eating your broccoli. And we're going to make sure that you really enjoy it, whether
yeah,
it's in Minneapolis or whatever. Could I add something too, before we slide away? On page 90 of this chapter, I hope all of you have had a chance to read the lyrics of Bruce Springsteen's The Streets of Minneapolis that he composed on the night of um Alex Preddy's um, killing. Um, I think they're, for a pop piece of music composed almost on the site, they're pretty compelling. And I told Andy Ron the other day I was really appreciative of the fact that the Tribune printed the lyrics and not just alluded to them with a headline at the top of the fold.
yeah.
And that Bruce Springsteen, I may have mentioned this before, really put words and music to define Alex Preddy's death.
I've not read those. I need to read it. I've heard about the song.
It's on YouTube, and yeah, it's worth a listen. I think it's shot to number one on the Billboard
Oh,
Top 100.
there we go. Talk
Very,
about prophetic criticism, right?
yes, exactly.
Well, thank you. Yeah, certainly Springsteen and Bob Dylan and before him Woody Guthrie and so many others have played that role and understood themselves as playing that role. Um, when we come back next time, we'll start in with chapter 6. I'll do a little brief conclusion of chapter 5, which is entitled "The Politics of Justice and Compassion," and then we'll look at chapter 6, which is going to be the other side, the second Isaiah side on the emerging and amazement, energizing and amazement in Jesus of Nazareth. So hope you all have a good week, and I will see you next time, if not before. Thanks. See you later. Bye, Al.